Hello and welcome to the Measure of Whisky, where we discuss all things Scotch whisky. This week, let's answer the following question. Why is single malt Scotch whisky so expensive?
Friday and the race is on. The city's gonna be a mess before.
Alright, welcome back subscribers, and a warm welcome to anyone who is new to the channel. Today we're going to talk about some of the reasons why single malt Scotch whisky is so expensive. Now first of all, let's make a clear distinction between blended and single malt. Generally speaking, blended whiskies are a lot cheaper than single malts. Now I know there are deluxe blends, some of which are very expensive, but by and large the blended market is a lot more affordable than the single malt Scotch market. So what we're going to try and do today is dive into some of the reasons why single malt Scotch whisky is so expensive, not only in comparison to some of the blends, but in comparison to a lot of other liquor that's on the shelf when you go to the liquor store. Well, first of all, supply and demand. Very simple economics. The Scotch whisky industry is in a massive boom at the moment. Traditionally it goes through boom and bust periods, but right now Scotch, and in particular single malt Scotch whisky, is having an incredible resurgence. There are numerous amounts of new distilleries opening all over Scotland with the goal and the aim of producing single malt Scotch whisky. Currently the Scotch whisky market equates to about $32 billion US worldwide every year. And there's a projection that that's going to go up to about $50 billion US every year. So that's quite a significant increase. Another reason Scotch whisky is so expensive is the production process itself. Right from the mashing of the barley to the fermentation process up to the cuts of the spirit after it's coming out the still. At each stage there is meticulous attention to detail. Scientific levels of expertise are required in order to make the spirit as good as it actually is, and all that process, that costs money. Next we have the cost of raw materials. So in any Scotch whisky there are only ever three raw ingredients. We've got barley, water and yeast. Now in Scotland water's pretty cheap, there's a lot of it, so that's in abundance, there's no issue there. But barley and yeast, again, supply and demand. As there are more distilleries being created, there is a higher demand for barley and yeast, which raises the price point of those ingredients. The other factor that you need to consider here also is that every single distillery will only ever use the best of the best. Subpar raw ingredients would never cut it in a Scotch whisky distillery, so that's going to cost some money as well. The next part of the process, once you've created your new make spirit, is you have to store that new make spirit in an oak barrel. Now the cost of that barrel can vary significantly, from an ex-bourbon cask in the US all the way up to a super rare ex-sherry cask from somewhere like Spain. So whichever style of cask the distillery chooses to mature its whisky in is going to have an impact on the price point. The rarer the cask, the higher the price point. And that brings me to the next point, and probably the most significant factor that we have in trying to understand why single malt Scotch whisky is so expensive. The aging process, the maturation process. First of all, it has to be matured in that barrel, in that oak barrel, for a minimum of 3 years. But the majority of single malt Scotch whisky is matured for around about 10 to 12 years. So if you think about that, right, it's sitting in that barrel in a warehouse for a minimum of about 10 to 12 years there. There are so many costs associated with that. First of all, you've got the cost of storage. And you have to store thousands of these barrels for a decade at least, right? That's going to cost some money. Then you have to employ people to go around the warehouse with all these thousands of barrels and make sure that each one of these barrels is maturing exactly as the distillery manager wants them to mature. So somebody's going round and they're testing each one of these barrels, you know, on a very regular basis to make sure that it's going in the direction that it should be. And then of course you have the angel's share, the amount of evaporation that happens in those barrels over time. Now in Scotland, it's between 1 to 2% a year. So 1 to 2% of the liquid that's inside the barrel will evaporate each year. If you calculate that over a decade, you know, you could be upwards of 20% of that barrel has disappeared into the atmosphere, right? And the longer you keep that barrel in maturation process, the more of it is going to evaporate. Therefore, the longer that whiskey stays in the barrel, the less whiskey there's going to be when it comes to bottling it. So you're basically rarefying the commodity there, which of course is going to increase the price point. A little interesting fact for you here. Every single year, 29 million gallons of Scotch whisky is lost to the angel's share. 29 million gallons. That's the equivalent of 44 full-size Olympic swimming pools every year going to the angel's share. Now, I don't want to get into too much detail as to why certain distilleries will mature their whisky for decades and decades, but typically speaking, the longer the whisky stays in the barrel, the more opportunity it has for that diffusion process. There's a chemical experiment happening inside that barrel consistently. The whisky is imparting flavours, aromas, colours, all from the wood that's surrounding it. And it's expelling various different sulphurs and uncharacteristic tastes that typically don't go so well. So, over time, you should end up with a far superior product. That's going to increase the cost. Right, so there's one last thing I want to talk about, which I find very significant and I think is really important as to why the cost of single malt Scotch whisky is so expensive. And that's the fact that when you purchase a single malt Scotch whisky, you're also purchasing part of that heritage, you're purchasing part of that history. You know, there have been lots of individuals who have spent years and decades lovingly caring for the whisky inside that barrel. They really want it to be as good as it possibly can be. They genuinely put heart and soul into every single bottle that's put out there, and I think that is worth paying a premium for. You get to experience it the way the distillery manager wants you to, and most of the time I think that's worth paying for. Slange.
On. This city's gonna